Hi, I'm Dr. Christine Hanlon from the University of Central Florida. Today we're going to be talking about the historical development of communication models. You should have read a reading that talked about the SMCRE model, which is the current model that we use when we talk about modern day communication. But what I want to do today is I want to talk to you about how that model was developed over time and how those ideas were created and who created them. So first off, the first model of communication that most scholars talk about is Laswell's model. And keep in mind there were lots of models of communication during this time period. I'm just taking two that I'm going to explain to you today. So the first one is the Laswell model. It's called the transmission model. It was developed in 1948. It's considered a linear model. It's a one-way model of communication. And what that means is that the source was sending the message to receivers, but the receivers were perceived as more inactive. They didn't participate in the process as much. They were not active processors of communication in terms of being critical thinkers and those types of things. So we see it as a one-way communication, kind of based on that magic bullet theory, that we inundate the audience with this message and that will make them act if we send them this particular message. And that was very reflective of how they thought about communication during that particular time period as well. So with this particular model, it's just a series of questions. And so it's who says what, in what channel, to whom, with what effect. Now what's really interesting about this model, though, is that we see the emergence of the SMCRE model in these very first models of communication. A lot of the components that we talk about nowadays are right here in the model. So when Laswell talks about who, what he's really talking about is the source. Of course, being the first component of the SMCRE model that we use nowadays. This says what is the message being sent by the source to the receiver or receivers, in what channel. Now we use the word channel nowadays, so that language was developed back in the early the history of the communication discipline. However, the channel was defined different. So when we're talking about the channel during Laswell's times in the 1940s, 1950s, we're primarily talking about the five senses. And that's how when we're sending a message, we're sending it through these five senses. So the message, the channel is not seen as the mode of communication as we see it nowadays. It was back then seen as the five senses. So we have the same language, a little bit different way of thinking about it, okay? And it's still how the message gets from the source to the receiver, but we think about it very differently nowadays. The to whom being the receiver or the receivers, and with what effect. Now the with what effect has kind of dropped off quite a bit, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the course. But this is the basic model of communication that we use as our foundation in the discipline. Now the next model of communication that I want to bring to your attention is called the interactive model. It was brought up shortly after the transmission model. And the interactive model was developed in 1955 by Schramm. And with this model, we do see some of the similar components of the model, but we see the language being developed. And so we have two primary areas that we should be concerned about with this particular model. And the cool thing about this model is we can actually draw it out a little bit better than the model of the linear model by Laswell. So we have the receiver or the receivers, and we have the source. So same as what we've had before, but now we have the language emerging that we use nowadays in modern communication to explain the SMCRE model. The cool thing about the source is, well, of course, it's sending the message to the receiver. So we have the message being sent, of course, through a channel to the receiver. We always want to remember that there's a channel there. Same thing as we've had before. Again, this one's talking about the channel in terms of the five senses rather than the mode of communication that we usually talk about nowadays when we're talking about the channel. But the channel does exist. This is the channel. The message is going through the channel to the receiver. The cool thing about this is they add in some components that we really use to talk about communication nowadays, and that's the idea that we encode and we decode messages. And so when the source is developing the message, when they're constructing that message for that receiver, they're thinking about that receiver and how can I send that message best to that receiver. So they have an intended way that they want the receiver to interpret that message. And how do I get them to interpret it the way that I intend? Well, I encode it. I use specific types of language. I use tone. I use nonverbal communication to help me send that message to that receiver in a very specific way. The receiver then decodes the message, and so this is new as well. So we have encoding and decoding of the message. When the receiver decodes the message, they do so based on their own frame of reference, their own experiences, their history, and when they're interpreting, when they're decoding the message, they're interpreting that message in a very specific way, which may be very different than the way that the source intended it to be. That's key to how we think about communication nowadays. So the receiver is an active part of communication in this particular model. The other really cool thing that we see in this model is this idea of feedback. And this is something we haven't seen in a communication model before. And this idea that the receiver is not just being inundated by this message, they're not just sitting there waiting for that message, and they're not just being an inactive part of that communication process. We see that the receiver actually encodes. So the receiver is not just a decoder, but they are also an encoder. And when they encode a message, trying to make that C a little bit better so it doesn't look like an E, they go ahead and they encode that feedback that they're giving back to the receiver, or excuse me, the source. And so the feedback is being encoded by the receiver, and then it's being decoded by the source. Of course, we can see all kinds of communication problems that happen in this encoding and decoding process, miscommunication, in terms of the way that we interpret messages that are different than the way that they were intended. But we can see there's a lot of different components that are added to the Schramm model just a few years later. And so communication in terms of its history of the models has a long history since, the early 1940s is when they started developing it. It was actually published in 1948, the last Well transmission model. The Schramm model really moving us forward. And then, of course, we have that incorporation of the concepts of noise, which you're reading about in the module as well. So hopefully this kind of helps you understand the history and development of the communication model that we use nowadays, the SMCRE model. And now I'm going to do something kind of funny. I don't know. Let's see if it works. Let's see. Can I get it to work? That's funny. Hope you enjoyed the video.